Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to everybody out there who is participating with us in this important meeting, which is actually the start of something for next year, which we hope we can engage all of you in fully and actively. My name is Mike Dukakis. I was the governor of Massachusetts for 3 terms here in Massachusetts. I've been teaching at Northeastern University and at UCLA ever since, and I'm the chairman of the Boston Global Forum. But the person that really created this and made it possible for us to do what we've been trying to do over the course of the past couple of years is Tuan Nguyen, who in an earlier life was the founder of the internet in Vietnam and of an electronic newspaper read by millions of people, was its editor. Now splits his time between Boston and Vietnam, and it was Tuan's inspiration to create the Boston Global Forum to tap into the rich intellectual resources of so many of our people here in the Boston area, but to invite all of you all over the globe to participate with us through the medium of international online conferences. And to do this by selecting a particular important international issue every year and focusing for a full 12 months on that issue. We began with the subject of international occupational safety and health standards during the terrible tragedies that were taking place in Bangladesh and other places. And our topic this year, in which we are fully engaged, is creating a framework for peace and security in the Pacific. And we will have an additional conference, or possibly 2, between now and the end of the year, in which we invite all of you to join us to see if we can't create such a framework in a way which will make it possible for people in the Pacific, and for that matter, all over the world, to settle their differences peacefully and without having to resort to warfare. And our topic next year, 2015, will be the subject of cyberterrorism and what to do about it. So we have a full agenda, and we're delighted to welcome all of you, and especially those of you who are tuning in through the medium of this extraordinary technology, which makes it possible for us to communicate with each other all over the globe. And we've got some very interesting people here who are going to be speaking on this subject. We may have some, and will have some discussion here in Cambridge at Harvard University among some of our experts and guests, but next year we will be going out to all of you all over the globe and asking you to participate actively in what we hope will be a series of constructive recommendations for doing something about cyber terrorism before we find ourselves engaged in cyber warfare all the time. And so that's what we will be doing in 2015. We're particularly pleased to have with us the former president of Latvia and now the president of the Club of Madrid, Madam Vira Vika Freiberger. She's been in the Boston area, in fact, spoke yesterday at the university where I teach, Northeastern University, and we're delighted to have her and her husband with us. And then we're going to hear from a number of other people that have real expertise in this field. Have some time for some discussion here on the Harvard campus, and then wrap up with some interesting suggestions and proposals and projects which we are deeply involved in. So welcome everybody. Madam President, nice to have you with us. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Governor, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to join this distinguished group of specialists. And I must say at the outset that I am by no means an expert of any sort in all things cybernetic. My husband rather is, and he sort of looks after that side of it in our family, in our daily affairs. And I think that in most families today, what we frequently find is that acquaintance with the modern electronic means of communication is highest among some members of a family, but particularly the youngest ones. We have a grandson that just turned 4 a few days ago, and I have a feeling that he was practically weaned on an iPad, and truly his favorite toy is this new medium of communication. The topic that will be of concern next year, but that is already starting to concern you here in the Boston Global Forum, of cyber terrorism and cyber crime, takes various forms. You open your daily newspaper, and this morning, for instance, you would see a headline saying that 75 million people's accounts had been compromised by a cyber attack on the files, on the records of that large institution. And it's clear that if your bank account and access to it comes in the wrong hands, this is very bad news for any individual involved. But when you multiply that by not just the original million that the company admitted, but by 75 million, you realize the enormity of the harm that could be done. But we have also had cyber attacks already on countries that have been traced back to other countries which obviously are not, don't have the friendliest of intentions, to put it mildly. Therefore, security, in the broadest sense of the word, for any system of government data keeping, of records, but also for very ordinary things of ordinary life, which have become part of our society, and on which we rely to operate properly. Any one of them, be it your airplane reservation or the way your airplane is being piloted, that are potential targets of terrorist attacks. But I'd like to mention that there's another aspect of availability of information in the cyberspace, if you like, and that is the recruitment of potential terrorists by spreading ideologies that by devious means first attract the attention of young people, then slowly suck them into activities, groups that are, it's almost like the brainwashing that one gets in sects. They get a feeling of being received in a friendly manner, of being found important, of being supported. I have been told by priests, for instance, in Paris suburbs, that in their attempts to get youngsters to come to church, they are competing with mullahs who offer 10 euros to every youngster who comes to Friday prayers. And for youngsters from disadvantaged neighborhoods, this is a very simple and ordinary temptation, which can then eventually lead to recruitment, to belonging in groups that not only have very fanatical convictions and ideologies, but that consider violence and random violence, which is what terrorism is, as a tool of preference for advancing their ideological needs. Then, of course, there's a purely technical side. If you wish to do harm on a random and massive scale, the technical expertise required to do that varies. It can range from the extremely simple to the complicated, and it's a bit alarming to see on the internet, for instance, that there are recipes freely available for fabricating Molotov cocktails. There are recipes available for synthesizing drugs in your basement or in your kitchen. Drugs which, moreover, because of their chemical structure, have a few atoms that are not the same as those that are on lists of illegal substances, and therefore for a while can actually freely be put on the market, and frequently because of the way they're being manufactured or because of their actual physiological effects, are extremely dangerous to, say, teenagers of high school age, to whom these are freely distributed at a very low price, with a promise either of ecstasy or of a unique experience. And this is, in many ways, the downside, or the flip side, if you like, of having available to us in cyberspace through various means, through various dictionaries, by now, maybe not the complete knowledge of everything that humanity has ever acquired, but pretty close to it. And if in the ancient days the Library of Alexandria and its scrolls and its tablets was a repository for all that humankind had achieved up to that point, we must remember the sad lessons of history, where the Library of Alexandria was attacked and vandalized, and the Serapeum equally destroyed utterly by either one persuasion of fanatics or another. I say this because I have the privilege of being a part of the International Advisory Board of the Library of Alexandria, and Alexandria as a city is extremely proud of having, with international collaboration and support, reconstructed that historical monument to humanity's thirst for knowledge, and made it a beautiful center of international intellectual collaboration and activity. But the repository, this, if you like, the digital repository of the world's knowledge today, is in many ways as vulnerable as any one particular location where it might be deposited. The Library of Congress is, after all, unique. You may digitalize, and that's something that will help. You have a backup. But the original documents are irreplaceable. We just completed in Latvia our national library, a new building by world-famous Latvian architect who has been an American citizen for the last decades, Mr. Birkerts. And this library possesses irreplaceable incunabula, which, if they were to perish, well, we would have their digital traces, but we would not have the originals. I'd like to address another aspect of the cyberspace, and that is the general information that we get available to us, not just, say, the words to a song that you particularly liked when you were 20, and you remember how the words to the third verse or third stanza of it, and you can instantly look it up on the internet, or who was the actor who played the leading role in some movie that you remember. If the movie happens to be Casablanca, you probably don't need any kind of cyber support for it, but otherwise it's available at the tip of your fingers. But when it comes to information that is not simply factual and straightforward, but that requires inevitably some aspect of selection and interpretation to it, then I think we come up against potential dangers, not just of terrorism, but of extremism, of fanaticism, of racial hatred, of general aggressivity of one group of individuals against another, mischief, if you like, on a very large scale. The propaganda, the political propaganda that we consider as a natural part of the democratic multi-party system can take a nasty turn when it becomes a single source of information about the political situation in one's country and the world on the part of totalitarian systems. Any totalitarian system in the past has always managed to control the flow of information available to its citizens. The flow of information, control of information is one of the means of imposing one's will, and it's a sort of terror, even if it is committed in the name of the state or of the ruling regime. The ability of citizens to evaluate things for themselves is a dangerous one to totalitarian systems, but it's also one that free countries and democratic countries, or countries in transition, should remember puts a heavy burden on the ordinary citizen. I had the privilege of chairing a committee on the freedom and diversity of the media in the European Union, and we produced a report that was deposited a couple of years ago, and we discovered that the plurality of media, the availability of diverse viewpoints and opinions is not as simple a matter as it might seem, and it's not necessarily as easily achieved as we assume that if there are free elections in a country and if it has all the trappings of democracy, that thereby all its citizens are able to function, if you like, with the full powers and decision-making authority that democracy on principle affords to each and every citizen. It is very clear that media are the way by which the ordinary citizen has a window on the world. Nobody can be present everywhere at once. Nobody can witness important events personally. You're lucky if you sometimes see them at a distance. The media are truly deserving of their name, that they are the medium by which information flows. And the technical infrastructures of media, it will be the print medium or the electronic medium. In a way, the technicalities become secondary to the fact of the editorial choice, the editorial content of what is presented to the public. This, I believe, is an important issue that has to be addressed equally in all countries, regardless of the level of democratic freedoms that they enjoy. In those countries that see themselves as free, open, and democratic, vigilance, I think, is the order of the day. One should remain vigilant about maintaining a diversity of opinions available, a diversity of sources of information, and no human being having the privilege of claiming to have the absolute truth at their disposal and the absolute ultimate verities to present to you. One should do so with all due humility and allow for other viewpoints to be expressed. But what is truly alarming is that in many countries which are making progress, for instance in economic terms, which are like China, lifting millions out of dire poverty, the desire to control information on the part of governments remains as strong as ever. And we see also recently the Russian president announcing that they are going to take measures to have special servers for information that pertains to Russia. The argumentation for it is presented in the name of security and national security, and of course this is to some extent a legitimate concern for any country, the security of the information concerning its own internal affairs, but it very quickly can become an instrument of political control and an instrument of keeping people in the dark about what is happening. We hear that on mainland China, for instance, the media have been completely silent about the demonstrations happening in Hong Kong. Now, you might say the news, the daily news, can only report so much information. If you open any channel in America, you may object to the narrowness of the range of topics that it presents to your attention. And I suppose that the Chinese might make equal claims and say, well, some people gathering on the street is not newsworthy enough to deserve a place on our national news. But you can clearly see what the political implications are of this sort of choices. So that, you see, we have here a situation where the technical infrastructure of media, which in some ways is subsidiary, it is secondary to the content, to the editorial approach, to the choice and the viewpoint that you're going to present. But then we come full circle, because if somebody comes up with a new device, if somebody invents a way of circumventing, say, the firewalls that some country has built around its internet, or the controls that it has imposed on its media, I think that there would be a wonderful opportunity, not just for somebody to make a fortune, but for the people concerned as its customers to have new opportunities for exercising their God-given right to actually pick and choose what it is they think about certain events in the world, and where they really, we would consider it as part of democratic rights that people should have the right of access to information that is as broad, as diversified, and as objective as possible. But I have had journalists, professional journalists from well-respected international television companies admit to me that even if you go, for instance, on Tahrir Square, as when there used to be these demonstrations in Cairo, your camera can only point in one direction. And that means that even in such a large event where 1 million people might be present, the scene that you choose to focus on, the face that you do put on your camera, is going to be one that you choose as operator of that camera, or later as editor of the news presentation. We have before us, ladies and gentlemen, unheard of and unlimited potentials for new access to information of the most unimaginable kind. This is a bonanza. It is, sometimes it seems overwhelming, but it's a wonderful privilege to have lived that long and to have experienced this immense explosion of information available to us. But at the same time, the challenges that it poses, the misuses, the potential misuses, clearly must be kept in mind. And so I think I have to conclude again with the same idea. that even as we are excited about the possibilities, we must remain extremely vigilant and careful about the dangers that such media can pose to human rights, to human freedoms, and to civil liberties in the largest sense of the word. Thank you very much for your attention.
Madam President, thank you very much. It's a great way to kick this off and to kind of set the stage for our discussion of what I hope is going to be a good, lively, and productive year next year as we get into this subject in great detail. We now have 4 speakers who will give brief statements expressing their own views on this. They come from a variety of disciplines. They've got all interesting backgrounds in this field. And we're going to begin with Anders Core, who is the principal in Core Analytics. It's a major contributor to our last conference on the subject of peace and security in the Pacific, and is back with us. Anders, welcome.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Madam President. Great slide. I'm going to cover cybersecurity very, very broadly. In general, there are 4 types of major cyber threats: cyber war, cyber terror, cyber crime, and cyber surveillance. Slide. Cyber war is the use of cyber tactics to destroy industrial, military, and civilian assets of an enemy country. An example is Stuxnet, which was a joint US-Israel attack on Iran's centrifuges, discovered in 2010. It destroyed 20% of Iran's uranium centrifuge capacity. Slide. That type of remote control attack can be used against anything. It can be used against a carrier in the Pacific. It could be used against nuclear command and control. So it's a very dangerous remote control capability. Cybercrime. These are non-state actors, legal use of information technology for personal gain. What you see here is a photo of Ukrainian and Russian hackers who were in July 2013. They were caught as the announced biggest cybercrime ever by money lost. It was 300 million in losses. Only 3 of the 5 hackers were actually caught. Cyber terror, use of computer networks to terrorize a population for political purposes. The photo is elite Iranian Quds Force, which has their own cyber attack group. Iranian attacks on US banks have been huge and focused. They're in retaliation for sanctions and attacks on their own security systems, including the Stuxnet. Cyber surveillance is the use of cyber tactics to closely observe criminals, enemies, or competitors. In this picture, you see the snake going from the Chinese to the American side, but I'm sure there's a snake going the other way as well. The types of targets that are attacked, I'm going to cover next. Financial and retail sector targets. This is the CEO of Target, or former CEO of Target before he got fired or were forced to resign. In 2013, during the holidays, 40 million credit cards were lost, and this guy was let go. Government targets. Estonia in 2007 moved a bronze statue of Talon, which you see here, which was a Soviet-era war memorial. The Russians decided to retaliate for this, which included a cyber attack, distributed denial of service on Estonian government portals. Elite targets, organizations and individuals included. This is John Bolton. Iran used his name and personage and persona, they stole it, to fish for other elites in 2014 using Facebook, LinkedIn, and other sites. IT company targets, including Google, Facebook, Yahoo, AOL, etc. Now, from a company perspective, all right, they see the NSA as targeting them and their clients with national security letters, which you see here in gag orders. Cyber tactics. These include a whole laundry list of tactics that have scary sounding names: phishing, Trojans, distributed denial of service attacks, watering hole attacks, malicious bots, false flag operations, backdoors, storage of encrypted data for later use using crypto analysis. The US, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea all do this. I won't get into technical details because this is a broad policy discussion, but you may get more technical information later. Some of the counter tactics in terms of their sophistication, I'm just going to name one, is perfect forward secrecy. It's changing an ephemeral encryption key every hour, every minute, depending on the level of security you need. And the old keys are deleted and not retained. This is a form of polymorphism. This is an example of that kind of thing. On the top, you see static username inputs. On the bottom, you see username inputs that are randomized and regenerated and then deleted every few hours, every hour, every minute. So these things are quite complicated. I have a few policy recommendations, starting with NATO. This is the NATO Computer Incident Response Capability Team located in Estonia. They're teeny, 40 full-time employees. They were very slow to come to in position. They were only given 60 million euros, and that they spent that during a period of 3 years in order to deploy. They've got to be much larger. They've got to have a rapid defense and reaction force capability. Right now, if they're to take real action, they need to go through the NATO command, which requires political decisions that are very broad across very many countries. We need a rapid reaction force that's NATO controlled. The current global cybersecurity budget is possibly 80 billion to 100 billion. These are rough figures, contested figures, but we've got to have much more than that. We've got to double our cybersecurity budgets at least. There are a few cheap wins that we can do, requiring two-factor authentication, requiring encryption on the cloud. We need to determine too big to fail information systems and require insurance, reinsurance, and final government backing for those systems. We need to develop stress testing of interconnected systems. We need to focus not only on defensive cybersecurity, but we need to focus on offensive cybersecurity. These are two sides of the same coin. You don't know what you need to defend against unless you yourself are on the cutting edge of offensive capabilities. These cybersecurity research and development in the United States needs to be centralized, I would argue, in the Department of Defense, because they need both that offensive capability as well as that defensive capability. Finally, for the US, there's some question about how much exactly is being spent on cybersecurity. I've heard different numbers, 26 billion a year for cyber budget for the Defense Department in 2014 with 6,000 cyber warriors. Another number I've heard, possibly as a proposal, is 60 billion for cyber budget for DHS in the future. I would argue, given the massive costs of cyber breaches, both to the US economy and potentially to the US military in terms of command and control of its most critical weaponry like nuclear weaponry or aircraft carriers, we've got to at least double our cybersecurity. I would argue that we should bring it up to about 120 billion minimum. That's 20% of the Defense Department budget. Thank you very much, and it's a serious issue. I'd like to repeat what you said, which I think is incredibly important. We've got to get our youth involved in the technical aspects of cybersecurity. We've got to teach our youth at the young age, starting possibly at 5. This is actually when I tried to get my own daughter to start learning how to computer program. because by the age of 13, you can be a hacker, all right? And we need those 13-year-olds defending our nation from the hackers. Thank you.
Thanks, Anders, very much. Life isn't getting simpler these days, is it? Our next speaker is Josh Haynes, who is leader of cyber systems and leader of the Cyber Systems and Operations Group at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, and somebody with lots and lots of experience in this field. Josh, welcome.
Thank you. Madam President, you laid out quite a challenge for us. I believe a lot of what I've done at MIT Lincoln Laboratory has been over the past 15 years to try to understand where we can make headway in the cybersecurity game. And that involves trying to focus and be able to pick out parts of the problem that we can focus on more effectively. Oh, like this? Is this better? All right. So I'd like to try to help us think a little bit about how to understand and describe the cyber challenges so that we can make headway against them. So of course, the challenge was also laid out to try to avoid the arms race. We've heard a number of excellent comments on the range of cyber threats, the actions that can be taken, and the types of effects that can be had. And so what I'd like to try to do from a technological perspective, one of the things we do try to focus on is how to best make sense of what it means to succeed from the attacker's perspective and the defender's perspective. And this helps us model and understand, and I think it's a very useful tool that we can utilize. So I'd like to be able to try to think about, if you will, a set of events that we would carry out as defenders and a set of events that the attackers would carry out against us. So let's consider that sort of set of steps. So we try to think about perhaps the attackers understanding what their objective is, describing their objectives against our target, our system, whatever we present as a target, whether it's an aircraft or a aircraft carrier or an information system that has the ability to control a message to the population. They have to understand that target. They have to be able to get into that target from a control perspective. We of course deploy these computers. We use them, our iPhones, our servers that carry our email and so forth. Somebody has deployed that. The attackers need to get in. There's a sphere of control that we try to present around them. The attackers must breach that. So let's think about what it is that they need to do to get in and try to make that difficult. And then finally, what is the objective? What are the objectives that those attackers are trying to have when they are going after a particular computer system? We've heard a number of the objectives laid out already. I think a couple of good characterizations of that. But I believe that what we can really do is think both hand in hand about what the attackers' objectives are and what our objectives are. What we're trying to do is we build and defend and maintain these systems. So let's think more critically think more critically then about what the defenders are trying to do. What are we trying to do to defend these types of systems? We're of course trying to make it hard to get into these systems. We're trying to make it hard for attackers to maintain a presence in these systems. And then we're trying to make it difficult for them to have an effect. We're also trying to make it easy for us to to do the good things that we'd like to with our information systems and with our aircraft and so forth. And so from a technological perspective, we can map to each of these 6 areas, getting in, keeping them from getting in, staying in, and identifying the attackers when they are in, trying to have an effect and trying to prevent that effect. We can map into each of these areas technological things that we do, hooks, tools, there's a very wide array. But we use models like this, simple models, to help us understand and quantify what it means to succeed and what it means to cause failure on the other side of the fence. And so I would encourage that as a model to the community to use when they're trying to consider how to write that policy or how to guide the national thought on this. Really, we need to be able to come back and describe things that we can measure and quantify. So one of the things that we like to do, and maybe it's just a very small piece of the solution and could be broadened much more easily, one of the things we'd like to try to do is consider the job that we have to carry out, the computer system that we have to carry that job out on, and try to describe the relationship between the thing that we're doing and the computer system that's carrying it out. Terms are often utilized in the community, mapping the mission. The mission maybe is a Department of Defense term, but that's the job. How did the computer system support that? This is a valuable construct for us because it allows us to describe what it means to succeed. We can't necessarily prove that the attackers could never get in, the hackers could always be thwarted. But we can try to prove, we have a hope of trying to prove that we can always do what it is we need to do with that computer system. That doesn't handle all of the cases, all of the situations that we were challenged with earlier. It handles some of them. We'd like to be able to fly airplanes without anyone disrupting the ability of that aircraft to navigate and stay in the air. So we can map out and model the reliance of flying an airplane on the set of computer systems that help us do that. And I'd like to contemplate a number of ways, because there's some real, I think, technological messages in here that can also help inform the thought process. So we can do a very manual mapping. Humans can sit down, engineers can sit down, understand the plans, describe where the computer systems are flying the airplane, where those same computer systems are interacting with business networks, describe those places where attackers could get their bad stuff in there, where hackers could get their things into that system. And then we can also, because that's a fairly static view, that's a system engineering view, that's how you thought the system was going to be built in the beginning. It's not necessarily how it's used and operated, how it's evolved over time. And so then we need real-time techniques that will be able to monitor and assess and analyze the behavioral properties of those systems to maintain that mapping between a set of tasks, a set of functions, and the computing capabilities that are carrying them out. And so that dynamic mapping is also very important. That's one of the things that we spend a lot of time trying to research and understand. But it's just a tip of the iceberg. So then I think we need to consider, so if that's one part of the message, so one part of the message is what it is that we have to try to build or attempt to create as a better set of cyber infrastructure. There's a number of things that we will build into that infrastructure to enable its resilience. There are things that we might consider good hygiene. If we were only doing the things that we knew how to do already, like intelligent use of cryptography, intelligent use of two-factor authentication, as the prior speaker mentioned, these are hygiene things that would really raise the bar for the bad guys, the hackers, and really lower the bar for us, both as individuals and as an entity, a corporation or a company or a Department of Defense. So there's a set of things that really need to be built in from the get-go that we already know how to do, and it takes a little more will and a little more focus and maybe a little more time and money. That's one piece. Then I think we need to consider the model by which we evolve that system, that capability. These hackers will always, of course, find new ways to gain access to systems. That's sort of the name of the game in security. And so we need a construct. There must be both sort of political and engineering and acquisition constructs to rapidly evolve those systems so as to keep up with cyber threats. And this brings me to the point where I think we need to consider both lessons learned on the commercial sector, from the commercial sector, and also from the government enterprise sector. I believe in the commercial world, there are ways to define and construct the problem, put in place that SLA, that service level agreement, so that it's crystal clear where the innovation must take place, how to evolve that capability to provide the service at a known level. I think in the system of systems space that we create when we cram all these things together inside of another company or Department of Defense, I think that's where we need to be able to innovate and have models that rapidly respond to new technology and new constructs, both technologically and from a human's perspective, from a how do you get that team at NATO to operate in a new domain or a new against a new threat much more rapidly. So I think there's a lot of room to consider that business model by which we evolve our cyber capabilities. And then finally, I guess I would like to wrap up with a point that it's very easy to throw our hands in the air and say, oh, it's impossible. We can't possibly gain a headway against the cyber challenge. And I think there are a number of things that do indeed work in our favor. There are a number of things that we can put in place that allow individuals and corporations to have a surety. Cryptography, for example, used intelligently can provide a lot of control over the information that we produce and that we allow others to consume. That's just one example. Finally, also, when we're constructing a set of computer systems, the things that the attackers are exploiting are often, although not always, fragile vulnerabilities that are going to come and go. There are a number of things that we can do to make that domain a lot more resilient and sure, and sort of, you know, the set of computers that we put in place will remain at a certain level or certain standard of security for a longer period of time. So I think that's where I leave.
Wait just a second.
Sure.
Quick question for you. Deeply involved in the creation of global forum. Go ahead.
So Anders, the previous speaker, suggested that you have to invest in cyber offense in order to be able to do a good job of cyber defense. I hear your comments differently. I hear there's a lot that can be done defensively without us being invested heavily in offensive capability.
I think we do have to have an understanding of where the vulnerabilities arise and how they will be taken advantage of. I think we could spend a lot of time and money trying to understand all of those vulnerabilities and all of those ways that vulnerabilities could be utilized. I think that there's a lot of headway to be made on the other side of the fence against some of these types of cyber attacks, where we're really building resilience into our own systems. We're making it easier for ourselves to do the job.
Is that a yes or a no? You're
I think it's
half agreeing with him and half not agreeing with him.
I think it's a difficult question. I don't think it's mandatory. I don't think it's mandatory. I think that defending our systems requires deep knowledge of our systems.
Great. Thanks, John.
Yes.
Thanks. We're going to have some time to have a little discussion among all of us here, so that's just kind of a beginning, and I hope there'll be lots of questions and a good deal of discussion when we finish our prepared talks. Our next speaker is Bob Gardner, who has been in this business for a long, long time. Bob, where are you? And tells me it goes back at least 45 years. So a lot of experience, somebody who's been deeply and actively involved for a long time. Welcome.
So after 45 years, I may not have a lot of insight, but I have a lot of mileage. Let me pick up the question that the gentleman asked and add to the confusion. We actually do both. NSA has a broad, sweeping set of programs they call CNO, Computer Network Operations, and it consists of two components: Computer Network Defense, Computer Network Attack. And you can actually Google this and see what they do. And indeed, the analysts and the contractors, not just for NSA, but others that are in DNI and some of the other system organizations, do exactly that. And in fact, there's almost no defensive idea that you bring to the hardcore parts of the intelligence community where they say, okay, now let's figure out how to turn it around. So they do live hand in hand. Well, whether they should or they shouldn't is maybe debatable, but they do, and they have for a long time. I do want to acknowledge how serious this is, but I also don't want to insert too much fear and doomsday attitude around it, because there is, as Josh said, there is plenty we can do. But the first thing that we need to do, and maybe you can think about this, Governor, for next year, is the person that's missing from the crowd is a behavioral scientist, because, and as Josh mentioned, 80 to 85% of all the cyber problems that happen can be handled with good cyber hygiene that everybody knows how to do. We just don't. Target never should have happened. We don't have all the information yet on JP Morgan, so we don't know exactly what happened. But most of the things that have been in the papers for the last 5 or 6 years, the big ones, Home Depot, never should have happened. They were preventable. So we need to do something about getting boards not only engaged in the game, but to act responsibly and do the cyber hygiene that will take most of this off the table. Now, the rest is what's known as the advanced persistent threat. Those are the things that come from nation states, terrorists, and actors that are very well funded, very highly motivated, and very well educated. And I'm afraid we educate many of them ourselves. Those are the really hard ones to deal with. And there are some tools that, believe it or not, even with the gridlock that goes on in Washington, we sort of snuck in a few legislative tools in the early 2000s, right after 9/11, that do help us. HSPD 7 was a presidential directive that President Bush signed that determined what are critical infrastructure industries and assets, and what is it that you need to do to protect them. Very shortly after that, there was something that most people never heard of called the U.S. Safety Act, which defines and designates qualified anti-terrorist technologies, for which you can not only get the designation of it if you have something special that is a tool, but the companies that sell them and the users that use them enjoy special legal protections if there is a terrorist act that has some devastating impact. So we are doing some things, there are some tools, but we still have this 20% of the APT, the advanced persistent threat. And I think there are things that can be done, but before we do something about it, this is editorial, this is my opinion, it's got a 40-year perspective, but it's an opinion. Most of the cyber stuff that's gone on for 40 years, the resources that were allocated, the funds that were allocated on the basis of fear and anecdote, not specific analysis of what is the exposure and how do you fix it, right? Lord Kelvin told us to measure is to know, and we have yet to develop a good process to really measure the impact of cyber incidents in terms that are very meaningful. We have always, and I started out as a cyber geek, I even own a pocket protector, so I'm not being harsh to anybody here, but cyber people have always looked at this problem through the lens of the wiring closet, not through the lens of the boardroom or the state house or the citizens. And we have to learn how to do that. But in order to do that, we also have to appreciate what cyberspace is so that we can learn how to measure what is the exposure and what are the consequences. And cyberspace isn't what most people think it is. It's not about computers and bits and bytes anymore. In fact, it's about this silly little thing has 17 radios and sensors in it. It's not just computers. It's not just wires, because everything is wireless. The cyber that we talk about now, 20 years ago, was sort of on the side of the business or the operation, supporting it. It's now baked into it. It's not on the side of it, it's part of it. The whole thing together is what engineers call a complex adaptive system. And now with wireless, it's become even more complex. And pretty soon with the thing that we've seen called the Internet of Things, it will become still more complex. It is a system problem, it's not a cyber problem. The cyber geeks, like I once was, I also did system engineering work, so I can straddle both sides. It's not about what cyber geeks can fix. It's what system engineers need to look at first. Fortunately, there's a new technology in town that knows how to analyze these complex adaptive systems. And it was brought to us 75 years ago by Bell Labs during and right after the war. They actually provided a mathematical structure for analyzing complex systems just like this. And they provided other things called failure modes and effects analysis, where they could take a weapon system that had 500,000 parts in it and predict the mean time to failure down to the minute. That was pretty good back then. Imagine if we brought that approach to looking at a complex system, brought that forward to look at the complex cyber world we have. We could start to get our arms around measuring the impact of a cyber incident. And when we measure it, we know more about how to deal with it. And how should we measure it? Let's go to HSPD 7. What that presidential directive said is that let's look at the impact on critical infrastructure in terms of its financial, public safety, and public confidence impacts. Well, those are the very things we should be measuring now when we look at a cyber problem and say, what are those impacts? What is the value of those impacts? And use that value to drive the policies that we develop to protect our critical infrastructure and our citizens. So what I'm sort of suggesting is let's turn this thing upside down and say it's not a computer problem. It's a complex system problem, and it's a measurement problem from the boardroom and the State House perspective, not from the wiring closet perspective. And if we do that, we could measure. And if we can measure, we could know. And if we know, we could develop policies and technologies that help us deal with that 20%. But first, let's get some behavioral people in there to teach the rest of the business how to do what they already know how to do. And get some cyber hygiene going so we can take most of the problem off the table. That's my message. Thank you, Madam President, thank you.
Bob, thanks very much. Now we're going to hear from Llewellyn King, who's a member of our editorial board. Long experience with the media, the executive producer of White House Chronicle, a weekly news and public affairs program airing on the public broadcasting system. Llewellyn, join us.
Good afternoon, Madam President, Governor Dukakis. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm not sure that I'm the correct person because I have a basic philosophy, and I've watched a lot of these things over a long time, which is there are no simple solutions to complex problems until a problem gets so complex that there can only be a simple solution. And I think back in big technological developments, and where there were particular problems that seemed to have no solutions, or solutions that were so complex that they couldn't be implemented. They'll be too expensive, they'll take too many people, and something very simple comes along. I would suggest the Plimsoll line did a lot to stop the overloading of boats, ships. They still get overloaded, but not the way they used to. The early days of steam engines, they were lethal. They were ever blowing up. Along came the safety valve. Now, it pays to have somebody to make sure the safety valve is allowed to operate, or the Davis safety lamp. Often there is a simple thing that changes the equation radically and permanently. The other thing that I'm a great believer in is engineering, and in its largest sense. I spent a lot of time covering the nuclear industry, writing about it, talking about it, and at some conference I was at, there was a huge discussion going on about what would happen with a double pipe rupture. Loss of fluid, loss of cooling, loss of radioactive water, and all kinds of equations about the stress on the pipe and what would be its point of failure, whether there would be stress cracks before it actually failed. And there was one fellow there, an older engineer from the General Electric company, and I said, well, what do you think about it? He said, well, I'm an engineer. I don't think about it. If you don't want a pipe to break, I'll build you a pipe that can't break. Everything else will break and my pipe will still be there. What is the problem? We will engineer that possibility out. And that was a very simple solution to what seemed like a very complex problem. And as one of the things that happens in technology is that we start building this great big thing. Take the White House. It's an old mansion in Washington at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's very hard to get into it. I used to have a hard pass. I've been going there for a very long time. I also used to be a private pilot. I used to fly out of Washington National Airport, but I never flew that way because F-16s would come and dissuade you. And having dissuaded you, you would meet a lot of people you never wanted to meet, go to a lot of meetings you never wanted to be in, and probably some accommodations that you weren't anxious to enjoy. So there we have it. Under the ground there, they put tank traps all around it. You can't drive in front of it as you used to be able to around down Pennsylvania Avenue or behind it along the ellipse. There are tank traps. You can't get a tank in. You can't get an airplane in. You can't get through the gate. But just a week ago, somebody jumped over the fence, ran past the men with guns and dogs, right into the old mansion himself. That just proves vulnerability and how systems get tired, and a tired system has a kind of sclerosis, and the Secret Service was suffering from some sort of satisfaction it couldn't happen here. And when it happened, they were sort of aghast. They didn't react, or they reacted in a very strange way. So these are the things you're dealing with. Therefore, I think you should look at what aspect of a nation, and we're talking about a national thing in cybersecurity, what aspect of a nation is truly vulnerable, and if attacked with great hostility, essentially a declaration of war or a massive declaration of terrorist intent, would do the most damage. I would submit to you it's probably the electric supply system, because we live entirely by electricity, whether it is the lights in this room or anything else. And the electric system, which is partially old, with computers glommed on the top, it's really a 19th century concept, engineering-wise, with some advances, and then managed by computers nowadays, much the way that railroads really are 19th century, but managed by computers nowadays, but with the weaknesses of their genesis. The electric utility industry, after 9/11, a lot of conferences, I went to many of them, about what you do when you're under physical attack. And the answer from all the utility companies was pretty straightforward. We cannot afford to have every pole guarded. We cannot afford to have every installation guarded. Therefore, we will have rapid response. If there's an incident, and they were thinking about a bomb or an aircraft, they would immediately respond, and people would come in from everywhere, crews would arrive, things would be returned to normal, stability would return. Well, that doesn't work in a cyber attack. It also doesn't work with all you've thought about when something absolutely new comes along. Last year, in the spring of last year, a substation in California, just really actually in Silicon Valley, just in that region, called Metcalf, was attacked by somebody who knew what they were doing, or people who knew what they were doing, with high-powered rifles, who understood the vulnerability of a transformer. One assumes they also knew that you don't just get one at Walmart and pull it down and put it back in. Most of these are custom made, they're bespoke, and it can take up to 70, it can take anything up to several years to get one adequate to do the job that the one that has been destroyed or damaged. Some of them are very old. Every one of them tends to be unique to its situation on a utility system. I was told by National Grid that there's one operating somewhere close to here that is actually was first installed in 1909. Well, I was told this 3 years ago. I don't know if it's still going, but that shows you what you're dealing with. What happens if you can take out the electric system, and how many places would you have to hit to take it out? Well, we talk a lot about the smart grid, which is this new concept of interlinked use of computers to read meters, to interrogate down the electric line, to feed back to the home office, to get rid of the poor devil who used to tramp through the flower beds to read the meter, that kind of thing, to manage time of day pricing, to see what's going on, but it also introduces a new dimension of computer vulnerability. There are new wires, there are new systems, there are new ways, and there is increasingly more interconnection between utilities. Interconnection means electrons are connected, but then so are the computers that operate the systems. And you can't deal with a cyber attack with immediate response if it's very large, because everything goes down. You think about what would happen if one of the large electric systems, and they're now divided up into things called independent system operators. There's one in New England, and there's the well-known PJM further down the coast. If you lost one of those, and all of the utilities hooked to it, you would have a massive blackout, which would be very difficult to bring it back on because you'd have no other communications. You would have very soon you'd have no phones, you would have no other communications, you'd have no signaling lights, you couldn't have those trucks rush in, many things. You would have paralysis of a massive scale, and if it endured for several days or weeks, you would have a national catastrophe. You would have to have the military come in with auxiliary communications equipment, and of course, to maintain law and order. Well, the problem for journalists covering anything to do with cybersecurity, but most especially covering the utility industry, is that if a particular system feels it is vulnerable, they're not going to tell a journalist that. They would just encourage those who wanted to take it down. If they think they've got super duper defenses, they're not going to tell a journalist that, because that would advise their enemies what they were up against. So in a sense, and this may apply to anyone who's not actually in the security business, we are at a window in which the curtains are drawn, trying to look in. It is not easy to understand the complexity of the defenses, and we haven't yet seen, but I'm sure we will see, a simpler defense system, something yet to arrive, some grand switch that can be thrown, or which will be thrown automatically. I just cannot believe that we're going to continue. We'll always have the possibility of the man who climbs the fence, but we won't have the possibility of an armored car, if you go back to my analogy with the White House. So you have, in my opinion, the largest vulnerability is the electric supply system. It should be looked at. It needs to be looked at. I'm not sure the electric industry is capable of looking at it. I sat through a conference in Washington yesterday about the future of systems, about the future of use of coal and natural gas and nuclear and all sorts of things, and nobody mentioned cybersecurity. It was not mentioned. I made some telephone calls earlier because I was going to be here and I asked the Trade Association and some others about cybersecurity. They didn't have anybody to direct me to. They didn't have anybody to send me to. They weren't concentrating on it. They were worried about their fight with the EPA, and they were worried about the new ozone standards and all sorts of things. But whoever's worrying in the utility industry about cybersecurity, and I do hope there are a lot of people worrying about it, they're not getting through to the people at the top. It is a system that relies on steady, real time, keeping the lights on. And that is their concentration. They're not very good at looking into the future, and they're not very good at dealing with anything they hadn't dealt with before. The other thing is they too are very secret. They have to be secret. One of the interesting things that happened was after the Metcalfe station was shot up, there was a study done by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. This is not a security agency. It does not have anything classified. It's a regulatory agency. But the study, the findings were leaked, and there was an enormous fuss. The FBI was called in. It shows how seriously some people somewhere take the vulnerability of the electric supply system. Whether it is taken seriously, though, in the boardrooms, I much doubt. I think it would behoove those interested in cybersecurity, and particularly the amount of damage that an attack can create. I think you've got to somewhat quantify the damage. And we do in this country and other countries live with certain obvious dangers because we don't want to spend the money, we don't want to spend the effort, we don't want to go through it. I would cite the hardening of cockpits to keep terrorists and other bad people out of airplane cockpits. I'm a private pilot. We had talked about this in the 70s. Why don't we harden the cockpits? We didn't use that term. We said, why don't we put padlocks on them or something very simple? But pilots would sit around in the pilot lounges talking about why these airplanes are getting hijacked. At one time they were hijacked almost once a week to Cuba, to somewhere in the Middle East. And so I asked at the White House, I asked the science advisor, and he said, oh, that would be too expensive. The airlines say so. Well, of course, we had 9/11. That's a price, a much higher price. The price that wasn't paid because putting a few locks and bolts and bars on cockpits was too high, or nobody wanted to do it, or it had no sense of urgency. And then we had 9/11. Now there's cockpit hysteria. If you look at the door too long, you'll get arrested. I hope that we don't do that with the electric utility industry, because with a loss of any large system, there will be catastrophe in this country. And there would be loss of life from all the usual things, from respirators, from people climbing stairs in high-rise buildings, but also, unfortunately, from the civil disobedience which seems to come with the dark. Let's not get into the dark. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Well, Tom Patterson was one of the original co-founders of this organization. He is one of the nation's experts on press and politics. He's responsible for the Shorenstein Center here at the Kennedy School. Tom, welcome.
Governor, thank you. And Madam President, thank you for getting us off to a start in thinking about this critical issue. Now, a study by Proofpoint, that's a computer security company, found that 90%, 9 out of 10, of security breaches in companies occur through employee errors. Usually, an employee clicking on a link that they should have ignored. And I think if we're going to really make headway in this area of cybersecurity, it's going to take a massive public education effort. Now, I remember as a child, growing up in the early years of the Cold War, just how much the nation tried to educate its public about the nuclear threat. I was in Boy Scouts, and we were handed this little booklet. It was a plane spotter booklet, and had silhouettes of Soviet bombers and American bombers so that us who were 10 years old could distinguish between the two. Now, I was out in the middle of Minnesota, and I think if a Soviet bomber came in low enough for me to identify it and got that far undetected, we were probably in deep trouble. But in school, you know, we had to get under the desk periodically. That was our protection if there should be a nuclear attack. So we went through those drills. And the newspapers were filled with stories about the nature of the threat and what the public could and should do about it. We did have one farmer in my small town, outside my small town. He was either the most paranoid of our farmers or the richest. He did build a bomb shelter. The rest of them, I think, thought that their storm cellars would protect them. But that gives you a little bit of a sense of kind of how the public was brought into the issue. And I think we need to make somewhat of the same kind of effort around cybersecurity. Nuclear war would have been catastrophic, but it was probably always a fairly low probability event. Cybersecurity, less catastrophic, although what Llewellyn just described would certainly be enormously disruptive and costly, but it has a much higher probability. And if we worried about Dr. Strangelove during the nuclear era getting out of control, there are a lot of Dr. Strangeloves out there in the nuclear and the cyberspace, and a lot of unwitting ordinary citizens who can give them a pathway for their destruction. So what's being done in this area in terms of trying to bring the public into the issue? Well, not much in my view. I did try to do a search of the news coverage of this issue, and there's certainly quite a bit, but not very much on the front page. And most of the coverage is frankly episodic. So it goes into the particular event, these 15 million people affected by this particular breach, goes into the particulars of the event, but rarely ever talks about the larger issue and the threat that cybersecurity generally poses. We don't have much evidence on what the public schools are doing, but I suspect that's a pretty low priority given the other things that are happening in our public schools. And when they're teaching computer literacy, I suspect they can speak more about the dangers of going to adult sites than getting careless with their computers. And then if we think about the fact that I pointed out at the beginning that 90% of the breaches in companies are occurring through employee error, the education process in our firms is certainly not adequate to the threat. And my sense is that in fact the public doesn't know what to do but ignores it. I think they don't know what to do. I think if we did a poll of the American public, I would think that the level of cyber literacy in this country is alarmingly low. So I think the technical aspect of this issue is important. Advances in technology, we need those, and we need those badly. But if we think we can do this without bringing the public along and the kind of support and kind of protection they can provide, I think we end up kidding ourselves. Thank you.
Tom will be back a little later to make an interesting announcement and to further expand the work that we're doing. Ryan Ellis, come on up and join us, a postdoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. Sorry.
Thank you, Governor and Madam President. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'll be brief because I think I'm standing in the way of some fantastic announcements. Today, I'd like to talk very briefly about what I think is a very important tension when thinking about cybersecurity and cyberterrorism. It's the tension between surveillance on the one hand and security on the other. These two legitimate policy aims often come into conflict and tension when we think about cyberspace. They are particularly acute and drawn out when we think about how we combat and confront cyberterrorism. This is an area of current policy debate in the US and across the globe, and I think it's only going to increase in importance in the years ahead. So when I think of cyberterrorism, it might be useful first to think about definitions. It can be defined in many different sorts of ways, but I think there's two sort of general bins that I use. The first is to think about the use of cyberspace as a means of supporting terrorist organizations. Okay, that's one way of thinking about it. The second way that I think about cyberterrorism is thinking about terrorist attacks that are conducted through cyberspace. So cyberspace is the vector, the means through which the attack is actually propagated. Now, these are both very important. The first way is something that we're confronting now, thinking about how terrorist organizations are currently using cyberspace as a way of supporting their operations. So this might be thinking about the use of social media as a recruitment tool, the use of the internet as a platform to spread ideology, the use of network technology as a way of organizing and projecting power and logistics. Even more important, perhaps, is the use of cybercrime as a way to support and fund terrorist activities. Now, these are activities that are, for the most part, that first bin, that are already occurring, they're already going on. Terrorist organizations, like all organizations, are using the global, low-cost, ubiquitous availability of digital technologies to improve how they operate in the world. Thinking how we counter these movements is very difficult. What I'd like to focus on in my remarks today, very briefly, is that second category, thinking about the likelihood and the difficulty of confronting attacks that occur through cyberspace. This is using cyberspace as a means of conducting terrorist attack. As we move, as was mentioned by a few of the earlier speakers, towards what is known as the Internet of Things, when not only the phones in our pockets, but the toasters, the refrigerators, and the thermostats in our homes have IP addresses. The attack space for cyber attacks is rapidly increasing. Okay, we're becoming an embedded society. At the moment, the capabilities for severe attacks like those that the speaker previously described against the electric power grid, at the moment, the capabilities for those sorts of attacks really only exist for nation states and their proxies. That's the good news. Unfortunately, we have seen some significant events. Stuxnet, as was mentioned, the attack against Saudi Aramco, the sophisticated attacks several years ago against Estonia, which was mentioned by one of our, the second speaker, I believe. All of these appear to be the work of nation states or state-backed proxies. For the moment, very sophisticated attacks appear to be out of the reach of terrorist organizations. That's the good news. Now, the bad news is the future might look very different. As we think about how the terrorist threat is going to evolve, it is a real concern that tomorrow we're going to have to confront the possibility that non-state actors have access to sophisticated cyber weapons. So as we think about now how to confront this menace or possible menace, we have to think about how to balance security and surveillance. Lawful surveillance is, of course, vital to thinking about how we disrupt, degrade terrorist organizations. Collecting information about terrorist groups, their plans and operations is incredibly important. But at the same time, we want to promote cybersecurity, making sure that we have the good hygiene that's been mentioned throughout the talks today, making sure that technologies that provide the foundations for cyberspace are secure. That's also important. Now, the key tension between these two aims is acute. At a very basic level, the tools that we want to use and develop and the tools that we are using and developing to conduct surveillance also jeopardizes our own security. They make the technologies that we rely upon fundamentally insecure and open to exploitation. At the same time, as we promote cybersecurity, as we support the adoption of strong cryptography and encryption, it jeopardizes and risks degrading our ability to collect information and intelligence about terrorist activities. So here we see the tension between surveillance on the one hand and security on the other. This tension is most acute in two domains. The first is encryption policy, and the second has to do with what are known as 0 days or O days. If we promote strong cryptography and improve the security of communications both for us and our enemies, we are going to enhance cybersecurity. However, this also limits our ability to conduct surveillance. Terrorist communications, well, as the phrase is sometimes known, go dark. However, if we work to undermine and subvert strong cryptography standards, as has been publicly charged, we threaten not only increase our ability to collect information about terrorist organizations, we also risk opening ourselves up to new vectors of attack. We see the same tension reappear when we think about how to use newly discovered but previously unknown software vulnerabilities. These are what are known as or referred to sometimes as 0 days or O days. These vulnerabilities are incredibly important. They can be seen as problems to be fixed or resources to be exploited. As we see them as problems, the idea is to quickly create patches to make sure that our systems are protected and secure from hackers. However, if we view them as resources to exploit, we see them as opportunities to conduct new surveillance operations and develop new cyber tools and offensive capabilities. So the tension really is, do we fix the bug or do we let it exist and grow? There's many, these are just two examples, but there's many over and over again that we see surveillance and security are in tension. Thinking about how we reconcile these two important and legitimate aims is going to determine in a very serious way how we confront the growing threat on the horizon of cyberterrorism. I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan, very much. We have about 10 minutes, folks, to have a bit of a discussion here, and maybe to ask those of you who have been listening to help us as we kind of frame the kinds of questions and issues that we're going to be dealing with in 2015. We've had, I found this very interesting and enlightening, lots of food for thought here. So any thoughts generally about what we've heard so far and areas where you think we should be focusing particularly as we begin to develop an agenda for next year? Both participants and those who've been listening. Barry.
I thought the issue of greater insights into the human behavior angle of it was interesting, in that the reference to hygiene makes you think about how many lives are lost in hospitals each year because people don't wash their hands. Something as simple as wash your hands if you're a doctor has been very difficult to get people to wash their hands. How do you get them to do a 128-bit encryption thing that changes their password from Facebook every 2 weeks? Where's the effort in human behavior that helps people understand what incentives you need to create?
Bob Gardner, I think, were the person that raised this. We're obviously not talking about underarm deodorant here, right? Tell us a little bit, educate us on what we're talking about when we talk about hygiene and what we should be doing.
But I think fortunately for industry, there is something that we can do, and we're not doing that. That is get to the boardroom. It starts in the boardroom. There's been a lot of narrative, a lot written in the press recently about getting boards engaged in cybersecurity. But I'm afraid what I see, and I see a lot of it, is it's still security theater in the boardroom. They sort of give lip service to it. They invite a CIO in to talk to the board for 15 minutes once a year and check it off, and they say, we did our part. It must be policy from the boardroom down. And you know, when a public company has to write its risk narrative in the 10-Q before it's admitted to SEC, there should be something in there about what they're doing about cyber hygiene, cyber behavior, so that they aren't the next target, so that they aren't the next JP Morgan. We have to find a way to get the boardroom truly involved, not just security theater. I think that's a way to go that maybe is a little stronger than we can do with our public health system.
Bob, I suppose the CEOs of these companies have some responsibility as well. I mean, the Target guys, those of us used to refer to that company, left, but a well-known Greek American is still running JP Morgan. So, what responsibility do they have? I mean, you would think that
they have a complete responsibility. Look, we may not take advantage of this yet, but after Iran and Sarbanes, obviously, not knowing is not a defense, right? And so when boards and CEOs know that a cyber incident makes them change the contents of their next 10-Q, make them change their presentation to their shareholders, and make them responsible for that, then I think we'll start to see them respond a little bit more. And I think that's a place to start to attack the problem.
Okay, any other thoughts? Elliot.
My fear is not so much the small issues, but if one major cyber attack against the electrical system occurs, what the public will do, even if it's only for 3 or 4 days, because we're not used to that sort of thing. And it's the lasting effect of a situation like that, which would do things to the marketplace, do things to the stock market, and things to fear. So I think a perpetrator can do an awful lot of damage with one effective attack, even if it's only for 3 days, 2 days.
Okay, other thoughts, other comments?
I just spent the week at the CYBOS meeting, which is put on by SWIFT, the folks that pioneered interbank financial transactions. And a couple of things that came out in cybersecurity, big data on cyber theft and cyberterrorism came up frequently. And in one case, as Barry pointed out, one of the panelists likened cyber warfare not as warfare, but as a disease, and thought we have to fight it as a disease. But another point that came up was we have this proliferation of apps developers, and the apps themselves bring vulnerabilities into all of our devices. And certainly none of the apps developers are thinking in terms of coordinating with security people. So that might be another new area as we go forward pile on the apps on our smartphones. Each one of those can be an entry point that can, I don't know, bring down loads, I suppose.
Okay, any other thoughts? Go ahead.
Can I comment on that a little bit? I think there's an excellent example in there if we consider the different models by which apps are brought to our phones. Some models provide a strong centralized point from which we can enforce and describe what hygiene means and ensure that it's been carried out, at the very least providing the hygiene part of that. And other models to get apps onto the phones don't necessarily have a strong centralized point. And I think that's something that we can consider as a trade-off. You know, maybe there's some functionality benefits on one side, but on the other side, at the very least, that there's a strong hygiene enforcement point there that makes it easier to trust the app when it's on.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah.
I have three quick ideas that I'm curious about. One is the question of whether cyber war is offense dominant. In other words, does the attacker have the advantage in cyber war? What kind of advantage is that? Are we vulnerable potentially over the next 20, 30 years as cyber warfare offensive capabilities develop to a massive attack that could be followed by a nuclear attack, for example? I mean, what are the costs? What are the possibilities? Really have to think out of the box on that. The second point is, are we able to attack the hackers? Okay? Are we able to identify the hackers from afar, find their machines, erase their hard drives? What are the attempts to do this? What's the methodology there? The final point is, what does the time continuum look like plotted against the cost of events? My sense is that over time, over the last 20, 30 years, right, that the cost of events and the frequency of events is going up exponentially. How do we balance that increasing cost of events over time with the amount of resources that we put towards mitigating the risk from those events?
Okay, all good suggestions. Kate?
I have a...
This young woman is an undergraduate of mine at Northeastern University.
I'm interested in exploring the new use of IP technology, which is low energy Bluetooth technology, which is introduced with the iPhone 6 for payment methods. And I think kind of a different approach rather than looking from the CEO to the people. If you're going to pay with your phone, maybe that's become a standard that you have to trust your phone and trust the technology that Apple or Samsung, whoever that technological company might be. And I think that my question has to do with, does the government have a say in that in terms of the standards that have to be set for cyber technology and threats down to people who are using it for everyday purchases? Because you have access now directly into your account as an individual. And I think the government can have a huge input in that if allowed by these companies.
Thanks, Kate. Any other thoughts, Madam President?
The absence of behavioral scientists was mentioned. Well, I actually happen to be one, for all the good it's happening. But there's a classic by Benjamin Lee Ward. He was not a scientist, he was an insurance adjuster. It's called Language, Thought and Reality. And it's a must read, I think, for anybody who's into risk assessment and the prevention of damage. Because Benjamin Lee Ward's job was to go and investigate the fires that his insurance company had to pay the damages for. And he tried to uncover what were the causes of these fires and how they could be prevented in the future so that his company wouldn't have to pay out so many damages. One thing he found is that the way people label a situation, the verbal labels that they attach to the situation can have grave consequences for the security of a facility, of the resources of a company. One classical example is of fire breaking out in a warehouse, and the owners being absolutely flabbergasted as to how it could happen, because all that there was in that warehouse were empty barrels. Empty. But it just so happened that these barrels had previously contained volatile fluids, and that when they had been emptied, the vapors from these fluids were still in these so-called empty barrels. They were empty of fluid, but they were not empty of flammable material. And so when somebody threw rags used in painting into these empty barrels, a violent fire broke out. And I think this echoes what some of the things that we've heard is Mr. King's presentation and others, that there are, if you like, high consequence events that can be prevented by very low cost and very simple interventions of the human factors type, if only you can target them and define them and find out the hygiene, if you like, that is necessary. So that in the case of industrial safety and security, of course, by now I think every company has some kind of directive somewhere on the wall that says any container that has contained flammable liquids must be disposed in a certain way and not just left around and be considered empty. This is very cheap. It doesn't require millions of investment. It doesn't require rocket science for the workers to learn it. It doesn't even require the Boy Scouts to have a look at the dog. All it needs is a thing on a wall, you see? So that there are a great many things that can be achieved at low cost with public education. But there are other dangers which are technologically extremely sophisticated and where the risk factor in terms of the damage done is extremely high. And then the question is, where do you draw the line? So how much you are going to invest in preventing them? Because the investment will depend on your precise and correct diagnosis of what the likelihood of this risk happening is. And that's, well, of course, it's a guessing game in many ways, but you can use mathematical models to help you guess.
All good points. I'm going to add my own, then ask Tom to come back up here and make an announcement. When nuclear energy was developed with potentially catastrophic consequences for the world, it took a while. But by the early 1970s, we had an international agreement of sorts, which invited nations to agree, if they didn't have nuclear energy, not to pursue it, and sought wherever possible to get some nations who were pursuing it to abandon those efforts with some degree of success. It's obvious as we deal with Iran and North Korea and other places that we're still working at this. What puzzles me is that there seems to be, unless I'm missing something, no serious international effort to try to deal in a similar way with this threat. Now, maybe it's happening out there, but I haven't heard about it. And it strikes me that even as we deal with these risks and threats, and they're real, that there should be serious discussions in this international community of ours about how conceivably to come up with a set of rules, treaties, whatever, that can make it far less likely that we go off and engage in another arms race, if in point of fact, it can be limited or conceivably eliminated. And that kind of discussion, I hope, is something that we will begin to engage in as we get into 2015 and discuss these issues across the board. Tom Patterson, come on up and join us.
So I wanted to announce the creation of the Boston Global Forum Media Awards. Like so many of our ideas and initiatives, well over half, maybe almost 100%. This came from one of our founders, Twan, is the inspiration behind this. We're going to give awards, media awards, in 3 areas: best connectivity platform, best content production, best cybersecurity products. not going to read to you the full criteria for these awards, but encourage you instead to go to the Boston Global Forum website, where you will see the awards spelled out and the criteria for each defined. And then there's a place there for you to nominate products for these awards. And at the end of the year, we have a jury headed by the governor, a 9-person jury that will look at the nominations, and then we'll announce the award winners in January of 2015. Thank you.
This too is the result of the creativity and imagination of Tuan. But what we're going to try to do is create an online museum. I'm not sure there is one, but in any event, we're going to try to create it. It's going to focus on the 21st century, and it's going to honor preeminent people whose innovations, initiatives, inventions, and creations have made the world a more humane and a prosperous and a just place. And here again, we're going to invite nominations from anywhere and anyone, and we'll review them and create what Tuan describes as an online museum. So we're doing some interesting things here. Elliot Salloway, you've got an announcement.
It's always great going on last because everybody's asleep anyway. I'd like to quote a guy who career I've been following, Admiral Bill McRaven, who gave a talk at Texas University this year in May, commencement speech. He's head of the Navy SEALs. His quote was, "If you want to save the world, first make your bed." I had a slide of my bed that I didn't get to make this morning because Tuan said I had to be here early. So I can't show that, but my role at Boston Global Forum is to be the project art director. The model for my work comes from an organization I co-founded 4 years ago called Exodus. We work in Eastern Europe and the US. With children who we have paint to the question, can genocide be prevented? That model we carried with Tuan's help over the last 6 months with a call from the world for submissions on the internet only of videos and photographs that also ask the question, can crimes against humanity be prevented, with particular attention to wars between nations, particularly what's going on in the Ukraine, what's going on, the potential of problems between China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So my job is to simply show you some of the results. We were quite amazed. We have 7 countries represented. I want to just say, when you're looking at these, there are no artist statements here. They'll be on the website. It was in many languages, so we couldn't get all the statements, but I urge you to look at these in the light of John Sosowski, who used to be in 1978, was the curator and head of photography at MoMA in New York. He wrote a book and mounted a show called Windows and Mirrors, Mirrors and Windows. And when his contention was, when you look at art, you can either look at it as a window into what the artist meant, or as a mirror into what you interpret it to be. I would urge you to look at these images as a mirror, because I don't, unless you go on the website, we don't have any artist statement. So we can begin, and remember that art can only ask, it can't answer a question. It can only ask a question. So, coincidentally, and this wasn't planned, this first image was from Latvia, Madam President, and I didn't even know it was first, but it was one of the better images that we had submitted. We have the names on the website. Here is the name of the artist, Pavel Trentiev. And the next one is from Cuba. Again, each one of these people had different issues in mind, but always addressing human nature and the interaction between the people and eventually between nations. This is Vietnam. We had several from Vietnam, thanks to Tuan. The Ukraine, Japan, this is Tokyo, Germany, also Germany. We had several videos. They didn't all translate to being projectable. This one was. Did we have the last one? This was an excellent video from Vietnam. Hopefully, we can project it.
Năm trước, tháng 2 năm 1979, quân Trung Quốc đã tàn sát dã man những người dân này ngay trên chính quê hương của họ, Lào Cai, Việt Nam. Hãy không để tái diễn. Đây là ngôi nhà của khu bảo tồn thiên nhiên tỉnh Lào Cai, nằm dưới chân dãy núi Hoàng Liên thuộc địa phận huyện Sapa, một địa danh du lịch nổi tiếng của Việt Nam. Tháng 2 năm 1979, quân Trung Quốc xâm lược đã đến nơi đây, phá đi nhiều biệt thự của người Pháp xây dựng từ đầu thế kỷ thứ 20.
the first of the first of many art projects, using art as a way of increasing awareness of the problems with social justice throughout the world. Thank you.
And a wonderful example, Elliot, of what this new technology can do in a very positive way. I mean, it was remarkable. Madam President, a final word?
Thank you, Governor. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a fascinating afternoon of discussion with a broad range of different ideas. And I think next year's program has only the embarras du choix, as the French say. You have embarrassment of riches here from which to choose what topics to concentrate on. And I would say that the two extremes of the range are those of high technology and high risk, high impact events and how they can be prevented. This, in an increasingly technological world, is an acutely necessary area of endeavor, and I hope that the Boston Forum will be able to continue addressing these questions. But at the other end, we have simply the human factor and human nature, and we saw these images of art, which art is a way of reaching out to hearts as well as minds, and human beings really are in their actions motivated by the heart more frequently even than the mind. We have to make an effort to be rational. We do not have to make an effort to have emotions. And one of the emotions that is partly part of the human repertoire, but is also very much influenced by culture and by upbringing, is the ability to empathize with others. If you were to reduce the problems of the world on the basis of all conflicts, I would say that the one concept that would go a long way towards explaining them is the lack of empathy towards the other, and that gulf, that unbridgeable gulf between I and thou, between I myself as something that is worthwhile protecting, or we as a group and a collectivity, and you or your group that are the enemy, and that become excluded from a definition of the human race. I think if we could instill into young children, starting from an early age, a sense of empathy towards other human beings, and in fact towards all living beings for that matter, that would go a long way towards this dehumanizing of the other, which is necessary before aggression and atrocities can happen. And I think that this is a very important topic that would deserve, I think, the Boston Global Forum to actually address it at some point in more detail. We find everywhere in the civilized world examples of young people or children actually enjoying cruelty to a surprising degree. We had at one point on the internet in Latvia a scene of some youngsters that had put a pigeon in a fireplace and then set him afire and filmed that. And one could hear them laughing in the background. The idea of torturing cats, of pulling the wings off flies and sort of thing. We think of these as little pranks, boyish pranks of childhood, but actually they are the basis of statistical behavior in which a living being is objectified and used as a tool of amusement. This is too easily transferred to the same treatment of other human beings. So that I think the training in empathy in schools, starting from a very young age, if anybody were interested in a project that is low cost but high reward value, then I would recommend, along with these artistic endeavors, that attempts at understanding what empathy, what it feels like would be a very worthwhile thing to do. But in the meantime, thank you very much. I have been personally stimulated by the presentations that I have heard, and I hope that all of you have done likewise, and I offer my best wishes for the continued success and activities of the Boston Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great way to end our afternoon. Tuan, a very special thank you to you and these wonderful young people who have made all of this possible. And now I hope you'll stay for a little reception, conversation, and more discussion. Thank you so much.